Zythara Station never slept. It hung in the cold dark above a dying brown dwarf star, spinning slowly like a metal coin tossed into the void. Thousands of species lived and traded inside its walls. The air always smelled like engine grease and alien cooking. It was loud. It was dirty. It was the kind of place where nobody asked too many questions, and everybody minded their own business. Commander Ethan Mercer liked it that way. He was not much to look at by galactic standards. 34 years old, medium height, brown hair that never stayed flat, no matter how many times he pushed it back. He wore a Terran Union medical officer uniform that had been patched in 3 places and washed so many times the blue had turned almost gray. He was a doctor first and a soldier second, and most days he spent his time treating minor injuries at the small human outpost tucked into one of the station's lower rings. Humans had only been part of the galactic community for about 40 years. Most species treated them like curious pets. Interesting to watch, fun to study, not particularly important. Ethan had learned to live with the looks and the whispered comments. Humans were short-lived, physically soft, and technologically behind almost everyone else. But they were stubborn, and Ethan was more stubborn than most. He was off duty that evening, walking through the lower market district with a cup of something that was almost but not quite coffee, when he heard the screaming. It cut through the noise of the market like a blade, not the angry screaming of a fight, or the excited screaming of a deal gone wrong. This was raw. This was terror. This was a mother watching her child die. Ethan pushed through the crowd and found them near a water reclamation booth. A Velithari female stood in the middle of a growing circle of onlookers, holding a small child against her chest. The Velithari were one of the elder species, tall and slender, with pale blue skin that seemed to glow from within. Silver blood ran through their veins, and their bodies were covered in bioluminescent markings that shifted with their emotions and their health. The child's markings were going dark. Ethan had studied enough xenobiology to know what that meant. Organ failure. The little body was shutting down, system by system, like lights going out in an empty building. The child had maybe 2 hours, maybe less. The mother's name, he would learn later, was Silethis Voronai. She was not just any Velithari. She was a high matriarch, one of the ruling class of her species. But in that moment, she was just a mother on her knees, holding her daughter, and begging someone, anyone, to help. No one moved. Ethan grabbed the arm of a station medical officer who was standing at the edge of the crowd. "Why isn't anyone doing anything?" The officer, a 4-armed cellith with tired eyes, shook his head. "Velithari blood chemistry is too complex. The child needs a live transfusion from a matching donor. There is no match on this station. There is no synthetic replacement. There is nothing we can do." "There's always something you can do," Ethan said. He knelt beside the mother and pulled out his portable medkit. It was a battered thing, held together with tape and hope, but the scanner still worked. He ran it over the child and watched the readings scroll across the tiny screen. What he saw made him stop breathing for a moment. The child's hemotype was rare even among the Velithari, but the protein structures in her blood shared enough similarities with human type O negative that a modified transfusion was theoretically possible. Theoretically. The word doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. He ran the numbers 3 times. Each time the result came back the same. A 60% chance of compatibility. A 40% chance the child's body would reject the blood and die even faster. 60-40. Those were terrible odds for a medical procedure. Ethan had been taught in school that anything below 90% was reckless. He looked at the child. Her markings flickered once, weakly, like a candle about to go out. Her small hand was curled against her mother's chest. 60-40 was better than 0. "I need a xeno-compatible filtration membrane," Ethan said to the station medic. and a direct transfusion line. Now. The medic stared at him. You cannot be serious. If that child dies because of your blood, the Velithari will— She's dying right now, Ethan said. Get me the membrane. It took 4 minutes to set up. 4 minutes that felt like 40. Ethan modified the filtration membrane with his own tools, adjusting the molecular gates to screen out the proteins most likely to trigger a rejection response, while allowing the compatible elements through. It was not elegant work. It was field medicine at its most desperate. He sat down next to the child, rolled up his sleeve, and inserted the transfusion line into his own arm. The other end went into the child's small wrist. The membrane sat between them, humming softly as it filtered his blood. The crowd went quiet. Ethan watched the child's face. She was so small. Her skin was cool to the touch, not warm like a human child. Her silver eyelashes lay against her cheeks like tiny threads of metal. She looked peaceful, which was the worst part, because peaceful meant she was slipping away. 5 minutes passed. Nothing happened. 10 minutes. The child's readings stayed flat. 15 minutes. Ethan felt the blood loss pulling at him. His vision started to blur at the edges. His hands were cold. He had given too much, and his body was telling him to stop. He did not stop. At the 20-minute mark, something changed. A flicker of light moved across the child's left arm, then another. Then a soft pulse of blue-white moved up from her wrist to her shoulder, and her markings began to glow again. Faintly at first, then stronger. A Velithari doctor pushed through the crowd and scanned the child. He looked at the readings. He looked at Ethan. He looked back at the readings, as if they might change if he stared hard enough. She is stabilizing, the doctor said, and his voice shook. The crowd erupted. The world was going gray and soft around him, and the last thing he saw before he passed out was the mother's face. Sci-Fi was staring at him with an expression that was not gratitude. It was something older and deeper. Something that had no name in any human language. He woke up 12 hours later in a medical bay that was not his own. The sheets were too fine. The air smelled like silver and rain. A Velithari diplomatic escort stood at the foot of his bed, tall and silent and armed. The High Matriarch Sci-Fi requests your presence, the escort said. Requests? Ethan asked. The escort paused. She was very clear that I should use that word. Ethan sat up slowly. His body ached and his head was pounding, and he had the distinct feeling that his life had just become very complicated. The child, he said. Lyro, is she all right? The escort's expression softened, just barely. The child lives, because of you. The matriarch has named you Velithar. Ethan's translator worked on the word for a moment, then offered him a rough approximation. Bloodbound, one who gave life. That sounds important, Ethan said carefully. It is the most sacred title one can receive in Velithari civilization, the escort said. You should prepare yourself, Commander. What comes next will be difficult for a human to understand. Ethan swung his legs off the bed and stood up, swaying slightly. He had a feeling that difficult to understand was the understatement of the century. The Velithari cruiser docked at the far end of Zythara Station was unlike anything Ethan had ever seen up close. It was not built from metal or composite materials. It was grown. The walls curved like the inside of a shell, smooth and faintly warm to the touch, covered in patterns that pulsed with soft light as he walked through them. The air tasted clean in a way that made him realize how dirty station air actually was. The escort led him through corridors that seemed to breathe, past rooms where silver-blooded attendants moved in silence, until they reached a set of doors that opened without being touched. Sci-Fi stood in the center of a room that had no furniture except a low table and 2 seats that rose from the floor like stone flowers. She was tall, nearly 7 feet, and her skin glowed with a steady blue light that made the room feel like the inside of a glacier. Her eyes were solid silver, without pupils, and they watched Ethan with an intensity that made him want to take a step backward. He did not take that step. "Sit," she said. Her voice was deep and smooth, and the translator in his ear turned her words into English with only a slight delay. Ethan sat. The chair adjusted to his body in a way that was slightly unsettling, as if it was studying him. "Your daughter," he said, because he did not know where else to start. "How is she?" Something shifted in Silithus's expression. The glow in her markings flickered warmer for a moment. "Lyrael is recovering. Her physicians say she will be fully healed within days. They also say this should not have been possible." "I got lucky with the blood match," Ethan said. "Luck," Silithus repeated the word, as if tasting something unfamiliar. "Is that what humans call it, when they risk their own death for a stranger's child?" Ethan did not have a good answer for that, so he stayed quiet. Silithus folded her long hands on the table between them. Each finger had an extra joint, and they moved with a grace that made human hands look clumsy. "I must explain something to you, Commander Mercer. Among the Velithari, blood is not simply a fluid that carries life through the body. It is memory. It is identity. It is the thread that connects every generation to the ones that came before." She paused, letting the translator catch up. "When a Velithari child is saved through the sharing of blood, the one who gave that blood becomes part of the child's line. This is not a symbolic gesture. It is a biological and spiritual truth that is older than our civilization itself." "I understand," Ethan said, though he was beginning to suspect that he did not. "You have been named Velithar," Silithus continued. "One who gave life. This title carries with it a responsibility that cannot be refused, traded, or ignored. You are now bound to Lyrael's bloodline." "What kind of responsibility?" Ethan asked slowly. Silithus met his eyes. The silver of her gaze was steady and unblinking. "You are expected to strengthen the bloodline you have saved, to contribute your own biology to its continuation. In the terms your species would understand, you are required to produce offspring with the mother of the child you saved." The room was very quiet. Ethan stared at her. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He opened it again. "I'm sorry," he said. "What?" "The right is clear," Silithus said. "The Velithar must—" "No, I heard you," Ethan said. "I just need a moment to process the fact that I saved a little girl's life, and the reward is that I'm expected to breed with her mother." "It is not a reward," Silithus said, and there was an edge to her voice now. "It is a sacred duty, the most honored obligation in Velithari culture. To refuse it is to say that the child's life held no value, that the blood you gave was meaningless." Ethan leaned back in his chair and pressed his hands against his face. He took a deep breath, then another. Then he looked at Silithus and said, as carefully as he could, "Matriarch, I need you to understand something. In human culture, this kind of obligation does not exist. I saved Lyrael because she was a child who was dying, and I had the ability to help. That is all. I did not expect anything in return, and I am not comfortable being told that my body belongs to someone else because of it." Silithus's markings pulsed with a color Ethan's eyes could not quite name. Something between red and violet. "You refuse?" "Refusing to help," Ethan said. "I'm refusing to be treated like property." The silence that followed was heavy enough to have its own gravity. Ethan was escorted back to the human outpost an hour later, and by the time he arrived, the situation had already grown far beyond his control. His commanding officer, Captain Reeves, was waiting in the briefing room with a face that said nothing good was coming. "The Terran Union has been notified," Reeves said. "The Velithari have filed a formal diplomatic petition requesting your compliance with their cultural right." "They filed paperwork?" Ethan said. "They filed paperwork to demand I sleep with someone?" They filed paperwork to demand you fulfill what they consider a sacred biological and legal obligation, Reeves corrected, and the Union is taking it seriously. The Velithari are one of the 5 elder species, Ethan. They have a fleet that could reduce Earth to dust. Some people in the diplomatic corps think you should consider the bigger picture. The bigger picture, Ethan repeated. The bigger picture is that my government wants me to become a stud horse, because it's good for politics. Reeves had the decency to look uncomfortable. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you what other people are saying. You need to be prepared. Word spread through the station like fire through dry grass. The alien species that shared Zythara Station reacted in ways that ranged from shocked to amused. The Chelith thought the whole thing was barbaric. The Dorvani thought it was hilarious. A group of Krethian traders started a betting pool on what Ethan would do, with odds updated hourly. Ethan's human colleagues gathered around him in the mess hall that night, and the conversation was equal parts support and disbelief. So let me get this straight, said Lieutenant Priya Okafor, leaning back in her chair with her arms crossed. You save a kid's life with your own blood, and now you're in trouble because you won't sleep with her mom? That's a pretty accurate summary, yeah, Ethan said. Humanity's been in space for 40 years, Priya said, and somehow we're still finding new ways to get into the most ridiculous situations possible. But underneath the jokes, the tension was real. The Velithari were not a species that accepted no for an answer. Their culture was built on obligations that stretched back thousands of years, and in all that time, no one had ever refused the title of Velithar. Ethan was not just challenging a tradition. He was challenging the foundation of how an ancient civilization understood life, death, and the bonds between them. And Silithis was caught in the middle. Ethan thought about her often in the days that followed. She was not what he had expected. She was not cruel or unreasonable. She was a mother who had watched her only child die in a crowd of strangers, and a man from a species she considered primitive had given his blood without thinking twice. He could see that it had shaken her. He could see that she was struggling with something she had no framework for. He received a private message from her on the 3rd day. It was short, translated into clumsy English that suggested she had written it herself rather than using a diplomatic translator. Commander Mercer, I know you do not understand. I know your people see this differently. But I must warn you. A delegation of elders is coming to the station. They will not ask. They will not negotiate. They will demand. And if you refuse them directly, they have the authority to declare you an enemy of the bloodline. I have seen what happens to those who receive that declaration. I am trying to protect you. Please understand this, if you understand nothing else. Ethan read the message 3 times. Then he stood up, walked to the viewport in his quarters, and looked out at the vast emptiness of space beyond the station. He had come out here to help people. That was all he had ever wanted. Save lives, fix what was broken, make things a little better than he found them. Nobody had warned him that the galaxy would make it this complicated. 3 days later, a Velithari warship dropped out of faster-than-light travel and docked at the station's primary port. The elders had arrived, and they had not come to talk. The Velithari elders moved through Zythara Station like a winter storm moving through a valley. Everything in their path went quiet and still. The other species pressed themselves against the walls and lowered their eyes. Even the Krethian traders, who feared nothing in the galaxy except a bad deal, closed their stalls and disappeared. There were 5 of them. Each one was older than any living human by a factor of 20. Their skin had darkened from pale blue to deep indigo with age, and their bioluminescent markings had turned from silver to white gold. They walked in perfect unison, surrounded by an honor guard of Velithari warriors in armor that looked like frozen moonlight. At their center was Elder Kithan. He was the tallest of them, his spine curved slightly with age, but his silver eyes, still sharp and cold. He had governed Velithari genetic policy for over 600 years. He did not care about human feelings, human customs, or human definitions of consent. He cared about the survival of his species, and he would do whatever was required to ensure it. The rite of acknowledgement was held in a chamber that the Velithari had commandeered from the station's diplomatic wing. The walls had been draped in bioluminescent fabric that pulsed in time with the elders' heartbeats. The air smelled like ozone and old stone. Everything about the room was designed to remind those inside it that the Velithari had been building civilizations when humanity was still learning to control fire. Ethan walked in wearing his cleanest uniform, which still had a patch on the left elbow. Priya walked beside him as his official witness. She had insisted, and Ethan had not argued, because Priya was the kind of person you did not argue with unless you wanted to lose. Lyrael was there. She sat in a small alcove to the side of the chamber, attended by Velithari nurses. She was awake and alert, her markings glowing strong and steady. But there was something different about her light. Among the silver-blue patterns that covered her small arms and face, there were streaks of warm amber. Gold where there should have been silver. Human where there should have been Velithari. The elders had noticed. Ethan could tell by the way their eyes kept moving back to the child, with an intensity that went beyond medical curiosity. The proceedings began in Old Velithari, a language so ancient that even the modern Velithari spoke it with careful, practiced reverence. Ethan's translator struggled with it, offering him fragments and approximations that felt like trying to read a book through frosted glass. But he understood enough. The elders confirmed what the doctors had already discovered. Human blood had not simply saved Lyrael. It had integrated into her biology at a cellular level. Her body was producing a hybrid protein, a fusion of human and Velithari hemoglobin that was stronger and more adaptive than either one alone. She was healing faster than any Velithari child in recorded history. Her immune system was rebuilding itself with a resilience that the elders had not seen in their species for thousands of years. Elder Kython spoke, and the room listened. The Velithari have been declining for 4,000 years. Our fertility rates fall with each generation. Our genetic diversity narrows. Our children are born weaker than their parents, and their children weaker still. We have tried every solution our science can offer. We have failed. He turned his silver eyes to Ethan. And now a human, a species we considered barely worthy of notice, has accidentally done what our greatest minds could not. You have introduced viable genetic material into a Velithari child, and she thrives. The weight of those words settled over the room like snow. This was no longer about one blood debt. This was no longer about tradition or sacred rites. The elders were looking at Ethan and seeing something far larger than a single man. They were seeing the possible salvation of their entire species. The Velithar will fulfill his obligation, Kythan said. It was not a request. It was not even a demand. It was a statement of fact, spoken with the absolute certainty of someone who had never been told no by anyone in 6 centuries. Ethan stood up. The room went still. In Velithari culture, standing while an elder was speaking was an act of profound disrespect. Ethan did not care. Elder Kythan, he said, and he spoke in Terran Standard because he wanted every word to be exactly what he meant, with no room for translation errors. I need to say something, and I need everyone in this room to hear it clearly. He looked around the chamber, at the elders with their ancient eyes, at the warriors with their hands near their weapons, at Silithus, who stood against the far wall with an expression that was impossible to read, at Lyrael, who watched him with wide, glowing eyes. I saved that child because she was dying, Ethan said, not because of your traditions, not because of politics, not because I wanted something in return. She was a little girl whose lights were going out, and I had blood that could keep them on. That is the beginning and the end of why I did it. He took a breath. I understand that your species is in trouble. I understand that what happened with Lirael's blood is important. And I am sorry that you are facing what you are facing. Truly, I am. But I will not be bred like an animal. I will not have my body used as a resource to be harvested. Not by you. Not by my own government. Not by anyone in this galaxy. Elder Kython's markings flared with a cold white light. You dare to refuse? I'm not finished, Ethan said, and something in his voice made the elders stop. It was quiet. Humans did not have bioluminescent markings. They did not have silver blood, or ancient rites, or civilizations that stretched back 10,000 years. But in that moment, standing in a room full of beings who could crush him without effort, Ethan Mercer had something that none of them expected. He was not afraid. I will not be forced, he said, but I am willing to help, on my terms, as a doctor and a scientist, working alongside your people to find a way to use what we have learned from Lirael's recovery. Not breeding programs, not forced reproduction, research, partnership, consent. That is what I am offering. The silence lasted a long time. Then Elder Kython spoke a single word in Old Velithari. Ethan's translator could not process it, but from the reactions of the other Velithari in the room, it was not a kind word. Two warriors stepped forward. Their hands moved to the weapons at their sides. Silithis moved. She crossed the room in 3 long strides and placed herself directly between the warriors and Ethan. Her markings blazed with a light so bright that Ethan had to shield his eyes. When she spoke, her voice filled the chamber like thunder filling a canyon. This man bled for my daughter, she said. He gave his life's blood without hesitation, without demand, without even knowing our names. He has earned the right to speak in this chamber, and he has earned the right to set the terms of his own contribution. If you raise a weapon against him, you raise it against the life of my child, and you raise it against me. The warriors stopped. Elder Kython stared at Silithis with something that might have been fury, or might have been disbelief. A high matriarch had never broken with the elders in front of a gathering. It was without precedent. You defend this human, Kython said slowly, over the rights of your own people. Silithis did not waver. I defend the man who saved my daughter. If our rights cannot make room for that, then our rights need to change. The chamber erupted into arguments. Voices rose and fell in Old Velithari, too fast for Ethan's translator to follow. He stood in the center of it all, his heart hammering in his chest, and waited. It took an hour. When it was over, a fragile truce had been declared. The elders would not force the right, but neither would they accept Ethan's refusal as final. The matter was, in their words, suspended. It was not a victory, but it was not a disaster. That night, Silas came to the human outposts. She found Ethan sitting alone in the observation lounge, staring at the stars, with a cup of cold coffee in his hands. She sat beside him. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Why did you not hesitate? She asked finally. When you saw Lirael dying, you did not stop to think. You did not calculate the risks to yourself. Why? Ethan considered the question. He turned it over in his mind, the way he might turn a stone in his hand, looking at it from every angle. Because I could help, he said. That's it. That's the whole reason. Silas looked at him for a long time. Then she said something in her own language, soft and low, that the translator did not catch. Some things, he was learning, did not need translation. Somewhere on the station, a militant faction was already making plans. And somewhere in a small medical bay, a little girl with amber light in her silver markings was dreaming of stars she had never seen. Elder Kython was a patient being. He had lived for over 800 years, and in that time he had learned that the direct approach was not always the best approach. The formal rite had been blocked by a stubborn human and a matriarch who had lost her senses. Fine. There were other ways. He made contact with a group called the Syndicate of Veils, a black market genetics operation that worked in the dark spaces between civilizations. They had no loyalty to any species and no respect for any law. What they had was expertise in biological extraction and a willingness to do whatever the client paid for. The plan was simple. Take the human, extract what was needed, return him alive if possible. If not, the genetic material would be enough. Kythan told himself it was for the survival of his people. He almost believed it. They came for Ethan during a shift change in the narrow corridor between the human outpost and the station's central hub. 3 mercenaries. A Dorvani with cybernetic arms that could crush steel. A pair of Krethian operatives who moved like shadows and smelled like ozone. They hit him with a neural dampener that turned his legs to water, caught him before he hit the ground, and carried him into a maintenance tunnel that led to a private docking bay. The whole thing took 11 seconds. By the time Ethan's colleagues noticed he was missing, the mercenaries had him aboard a small, unmarked transport ship locked to the station's outer ring. They strapped him to a medical table in the ship's cargo hold. The equipment around him was cold and clinical, designed for one purpose. The Dorvani mercenary checked the restraints and grunted with satisfaction. "Comfortable?" he asked. Ethan tested the straps. They were tight against his wrists and ankles. Metal bands designed for species much stronger than humans. "I've been better," he said. Back at the human outpost, Lieutenant Commander Priya Okafor was the first to raise the alarm. She had been expecting Ethan at the medbay for a routine supply check. When he did not arrive and did not respond to his communicator, she went looking. She found his communicator on the floor of the corridor, cracked and dark. Next to it, a small burn mark on the wall from a neural dampener discharge. Priya did not panic. She had grown up in Lagos, survived the Terran border wars, and once performed emergency surgery on herself with a field kit and a mirror. Panic was not in her vocabulary. She walked to the outpost communication array and opened a broadcast on all frequencies. Every species on the station heard what she said next. "This is Lieutenant Commander Priya Okafor of the Terran Union Outpost on Zythara Station. One of our people has been taken. Commander Ethan Mercer, the man who saved a Velithari child with his own blood, has been abducted from this station. We are 12 humans with 1 frigate and a medical bay. We are not a fleet. We are not an army. But we are telling whoever took him, clearly and without any room for misunderstanding, that you have 1 standard hour to return him unharmed. After that, we stop being diplomatic." The broadcast ended. The station went very quiet. In the bar district, a Chelith merchant turned to his drinking companion and said, "There are 12 of them. 12. Against whoever has the backing to kidnap someone from a Velithari bloodline dispute." His companion, a Yamari trader with scales the color of rust, shook her head slowly. "You do not understand humans. I have watched them for 30 years. They are not rational about their own. They will walk into fire for each other and consider it a normal Tuesday." "That is either the bravest or the most insane thing I have ever heard." The Yamari agreed. "That is exactly the problem with humans." Priya did not wait for the hour to run out. She had said 1 hour because it sounded good on a broadcast. In reality, she had already identified the mercenary ship through the station's docking logs, and was leading a 4-person breach team through the maintenance tunnels within 15 minutes. The team was not impressive by galactic standards. Priya carried a standard-issue sidearm that most species considered a toy. Corporal Davis had a breaching charge he had built himself from spare parts. Sergeant Tanaka had a combat knife, and an expression that suggested she was looking forward to using it. Private Reese, the youngest of them, had a medical kit and the wide eyes of someone who was terrified, but had decided that being terrified was not a good enough reason to stay behind. They reached the docking bay. Davis placed his homemade charge on the ship's emergency access hatch. It was not a subtle entry. The explosion blew the hatch inward and filled the corridor with smoke. Priya went in first, moving fast and low. The Cretan operatives were quick, but they had expected station security, not humans. Humans who moved with a reckless speed that most species found deeply unsettling, who absorbed hits that should have put them down, and kept coming, and who fought with a creativity born from millions of years of being the most dangerous predator on a planet that was trying to kill them at all times. The fight lasted 4 minutes. When the smoke cleared, both Cretan operatives were unconscious. The Dorvani was pinned against a wall, with Davis sitting on his cybernetic arms, and Priya was standing over them, with her toy sidearm and a split lip. They found Ethan in the cargo hold. He was still strapped to the table, but he had already managed to free one hand by dislocating his own thumb and pulling it through the restraint. The mercenaries, who had designed their restraints for species with rigid skeletal structures, had not accounted for the fact that humans could voluntarily damage their own bodies and keep functioning. "Took you long enough," Ethan said as Priya cut through the remaining straps. "You dislocated your thumb again," Priya observed. "It pops right back in," Ethan said, and demonstrated with a wince. Reese looked like he was going to be sick. Tanaka looked impressed. Davis was still sitting on the Dorvani and had started whistling. The aftermath moved quickly. Station security, which had been suspiciously slow to respond, suddenly became very efficient once the situation was resolved and there was no danger remaining. The mercenaries were taken into custody. Their communications were traced directly back to Elder Kython. The evidence was undeniable. A sitting Velithari elder had hired mercenaries to kidnap and harvest genetic material from a foreign national on a neutral station. It was a violation of galactic law, Velithari law, and every principle of honor that the elder species claimed to uphold. Silithus was informed. Her reaction was not the cold fury that most expected from a Velithari matriarch. It was something raw and more dangerous. She went to the elder's chamber and spoke to Kython directly, and though no one outside heard what was said, the elder emerged looking diminished in a way that had nothing to do with physical injury. Kython was stripped of his rank and authority. His factions splintered. The Velithari Dominion issued a formal statement acknowledging the violation and expressing what the translator rendered as profound shame. But the real impact was felt beyond the Velithari. The Galactic Diplomatic Assembly had been watching. Every species on the station had seen 12 humans go to war for one of their own, without hesitation, without calculation, and without any regard for the odds against them. The Terran Union, through channels that Ethan was not involved in and did not fully understand, proposed a joint research initiative. Human and Velithari scientists working together voluntarily to study the biological compatibility that Lyrael's recovery had revealed. No forced breeding, no genetic harvesting, partnership, consent, mutual respect. The Velithari progressives, led by Silithus, accepted. That night, Silithus came to the human medbay where Ethan was being treated for his injuries. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching the human doctors fuss over him with their primitive tools and their loud, worried voices. "Your people came for you," she said. "That's what we do," Ethan said. In the harsh light of the human medbay, she looked different. Less like a monument and more like a person. Tired, shaken, real. "In 10,000 years," she said, "no one has ever bled for us, fought for us, and then offered to help us with no conditions. You are something we have no word for, Ethan Mercer." She used his first name. It was the first time she had done that. Ethan, who had bruises on his ribs and a thumb that was swelling to twice its normal size, looked up at her and said, "So does this mean I don't have to breed with you?" Silithus stared at him. Her markings flickered. And then, for what might have been the first time in centuries, the High Matriarch of the Voronoi bloodline laughed. It was a sound like wind chimes in a storm, bright and unexpected and strange. "You are impossible," she said. "I get that a lot," Ethan replied. From the doorway, a small voice said something in Velithari. Lirael stood there, having apparently escaped her nurses again. Her amber and silver markings glowed warm in the dim corridor. She walked to Ethan, took his uninjured hand, and pulled him toward the nearest viewport. She pointed at the stars scattered across the black. "You show me?" she said in broken but clear Terran standard. "Your stars?" Ethan looked at the child, who carried his blood in her veins, and something in his chest shifted in a way that no medical scanner could measure. "Yeah," he said softly, "I'll show you." 6 months changed everything. The research station was built in neutral space, orbiting a young blue star that neither species had claimed. The humans had named it Hope Station, because humans named everything with the subtlety of a hammer. The Velithari called it Vale Thurind, which translated roughly to the place where new blood begins. Both names were accurate. Ethan stood at the central viewport of the station's medical wing and watched a Velithari transport dock at the outer ring. It was the third one this week. Each one carried patients, elderly Velithari whose markings had begun to fade, children born with weakened immune systems, mothers who had lost pregnancy after pregnancy to genetic failure. They came from across Velithari space, hundreds of worlds, thousands of families, all drawn by the same impossible rumor. Humans could help. The treatment was not what anyone had expected. In the early days, the Velithari elders who supported the initiative had assumed that hybridization was the answer. Human and Velithari reproduction. New bloodlines. New children carrying both species in their veins. They were wrong. Or rather, they were thinking too small. What Ethan and his team discovered was something far more elegant. Human blood proteins, when properly isolated and modified, could be used to restart the adaptive processes that the Velithari immune system had lost over millennia of genetic narrowing. It was not about creating hybrid children. It was about teaching old cells how to change again, how to adapt, how to fight. The treatment was called regenerative compatibility therapy, and it worked. Velithari patients who received the modified human proteins showed dramatic improvement within weeks. Their bioluminescent markings grew brighter, their immune responses strengthened, their fertility rates began, slowly but measurably, to climb. It was not a cure for 10,000 years of genetic decline. It was the beginning of one. And at the center of it all was Ethan Mercer, who still wore a patched uniform and still drank terrible coffee, and who still, after everything that had happened, introduced himself as just a doctor. The galaxy noticed. The Dorvani were the first to reach out. They were an old species, not as ancient as the Velithari, but old enough to feel the same slow pull of genetic stagnation. Their ambassador arrived at Hope Station with a diplomatic delegation and a medical file that documented 3 centuries of declining birth rates. She asked if humans could help. Ethan said yes. The Chelith came next, then the Yamari, then species whose names Ethan could not pronounce and whose biology he had to study from scratch. Each one came with the same story told in different ways. We are old. We are fading. We heard that humans can help. The irony was thick enough to cut. Humanity, the youngest species in known space, the short-lived ones, the fragile ones, the primitives who had stumbled into the stars only 40 years ago and still could not figure out faster-than-light travel without help. That species, those chaotic, stubborn, impossibly adaptable creatures, carried in their blood the very thing the galaxy's oldest civilizations had lost. Not technology, not power, not ancient wisdom. Resilience. The simple, brutal, beautiful ability to take damage and keep going. to change when change was needed, to break and heal and come back different, but alive. Human blood was not magic. It was not a miracle. It was the product of a species that had evolved on a planet that tried to kill them every single day for millions of years. Earthquakes, ice ages, plagues, predators, and each other. Humanity had survived all of it by being the most adaptable organism their world had ever produced. And now that adaptability was saving species that had looked down on them for centuries. Ethan tried not to think about it too much. The politics made his head hurt. The Terran Union had established formal partnerships with a dozen elder species. Humanity's standing in the galactic community had shifted from curious novelty to essential ally almost overnight. Diplomats and politicians were having the time of their lives. Ethan just wanted to treat patients. Silithus helped him keep his focus. She had become the Velithari representative to the initiative, a role that put her in direct conflict with the remaining traditionalists in her government. They called her a traitor. They said she had been corrupted by human influence. They said that allowing alien biology into Velithari bloodlines was worse than extinction. Silithus did not argue with them. She simply pointed to the data. Lyriel's recovery, the successful treatments, the first Velithari birth in decades where the child was born with a fully functional immune system. The numbers spoke louder than tradition. She and Ethan worked together daily. Their relationship had evolved into something that neither of them had expected, and neither of them tried to define. It was not the forced bonding that the elders had demanded. It was not romantic in the way humans understood romance. It was something quieter and deeper, built on shared purpose and mutual respect, and the kind of trust that only forms between two people who have faced the worst together and come through it standing. Ethan respected her more than anyone he had ever known. Silithus saw in him something she had never seen in any being of any species. A person who did good, not because of obligation or advantage, but because it was the right thing to do, and who found that reason sufficient. They never spoke about what they were to each other. They did not need to. Lyriel grew fast. At 7 years old, young by Velithari standards, she was already showing abilities that left her physicians stunned. Her immune system was the strongest ever recorded in a Velithari child. Her bioluminescent markings, that unique blend of amber and silver, were brighter and more complex than any adult's. She learned Terran standard faster than any Velithari before her, and she moved between human and Velithari cultures with a natural ease that made everyone around her smile. She had given Ethan a name in her own language, Ethol. It was a word she had invented herself, because no existing Velithari word captured what he was to her. The closest translation was, the one who stayed. Not father exactly, not by blood or by law, something more personal and more chosen than that. Ethan carried that name like a medal he had not earned and could never take off. The Galactic Summit was held 1 year after the events on Zythara Station. Every major species sent representatives. The assembly hall was enormous, a cathedral of light and sound, where the voices of 100 civilizations gathered to discuss the future of their shared galaxy. The Velithari representative spoke last. Silithus stood before the assembly in formal robes that glowed with patterns Ethan had never seen before. She looked out at the gathered species, all of whom were watching, and she spoke in Terran standard. Not Velithari, not old Velithari. She used the human language, and she used it on purpose. For 10,000 years, she said, the Velithari looked to the stars and saw only our own reflection. We believed that strength was purity, that survival was isolation, that the younger species had nothing to offer the old. We built our civilization on these beliefs, and we watched it slowly die because of them. She paused. The hall was silent. 1 year ago, a human doctor sat down beside my dying child on a trading station and gave his blood to save her life. He did not know our customs. He did not know our language. He did not know that what he was doing was supposed to be impossible. He knew only that a child was dying and that he could help, and that was enough for him. Her markings pulsed with warm light. We demanded that he give us more. We tried to take what we wanted by force, and through all of it, he did not hate us. He did not abandon us. He stood up in a room full of beings who could destroy him and said, "I will not be forced, but I will help." And then he did. She looked directly at the human delegation, at Ethan, who was trying very hard to become invisible in his seat. Let the galaxy remember this. When the Velithari were fading, when our children were dying, when our oldest and proudest could not save ourselves, it was humanity that said, "I can help," and meant it. Not for power, not for alliance, not for genetic material or political advantage, because a child was dying and they could help, and that was reason enough. The hall erupted. Applause from species that did not have hands, songs from species that did not have voices, light displays from species that communicated in color. The sound of it washed over Ethan like a wave, and he sat in his chair and felt his face turn red. Priya, sitting next to him, leaned over and grinned. "You good?" "I just gave a kid a blood transfusion," Ethan muttered. That's the most human sentence ever spoken. That night, the celebrations continued across the station, but Ethan slipped away. He found his way to a quiet observation deck on the station's upper ring, a place with wide viewports that looked out onto the blue star and the endless dark beyond it. Lirel found him first. She always did. She appeared at his side with the quiet grace of her mother's species and the stubborn persistence of the man whose blood ran through her veins. She pressed against his side and looked up at the stars with eyes that glowed amber and silver. Sylphis came a few minutes later. She stood beside him, close enough that he could feel the cool light of her skin, but not touching. They did not need to touch. They were connected by something that went deeper than contact. A child saved, a choice made, a future built not on obligation, but on something freely given. Outside the viewport, the universe stretched on forever. Cold and vast and full of dying light. But here, in this small pocket of warmth, three lives that should never have intersected were bound together by blood and choice, and the simple, stubborn human belief that helping someone who needs it is never the wrong thing to do. Ethan looked at the stars. He thought about Earth, which he had not seen in 3 years. He thought about the trading station, where everything had changed. He thought about a little girl whose lights were going out, and the moment he decided, without thinking, without hesitating, to sit down and give her what she needed. He had not known it would lead to this. He had not planned for any of it. He had just done what humans do. Lirel tugged on his sleeve. "Ethal," she said, "tell me about your stars again. Which ones do you want to hear about?" "All of them," she said. So he began to talk, and the stars listened. And somewhere in the blood of a child who was supposed to die, the memory of what one man had given burned bright and warm and refused to go out.